At 11:40 p.m., a lookout on the deck of the largest ship ever built rang a bell 3 times. Dead ahead, ice. The officer on the bridge had 37 seconds to react. He gave the wrong order. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, over 1,500 people were dead in freezing water, because a handful of men decided speed mattered more than a warning. That single decision is one of dozens you're about to hear. Some sank ships. Some poisoned cities. Some ended the lives of astronauts on live television. All of them share one thing. Someone, somewhere, ignored a warning they didn't want to hear. Humans built the pyramids, split the atom, and put footprints on the moon. But that same species has also looked directly at a warning sign and decided to proceed anyway. Again and again, across centuries, industries, and continents. This is the story of the worst mistakes ever made by humans. Not accidents caused by bad luck, but disasters caused by decisions. Decisions made by people who knew better, or should have. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic was the single most advanced object ever built by human hands. 16 watertight compartments. Double-bottomed hull. Newspapers called it unsinkable before it ever left port, and the crew believed it. On the night of April 14th, the ship received at least 6 separate ice warnings from other vessels in the area. One radio operator was so busy relaying passenger telegrams that he cut off an incoming ice warning from a nearby ship with the words, "Shut up, I'm busy." That warning never reached the bridge. Captain Edward Smith kept the ship at near maximum speed through a known ice field, at night, with no moon to reflect off the water and warn lookouts early. When the iceberg was finally spotted, the ship was moving too fast to turn in time. The first officer's evasive maneuver, turning instead of ramming head-on, actually made things worse, opening a 300-foot gash along the hull instead of crumpling the bow. There were lifeboats for barely half the people on board, because regulations hadn't been updated in decades and the crew assumed they'd never actually need them all. 1,517 people died. Not because the technology failed, because every warning sign was overridden by pride, schedule, and the comforting lie that this ship, unlike every other ship in history, could not go down. And here's the unsettling part. The Titanic wasn't even the deadliest mistake made at sea. Not even close. Just 3 years after the Titanic, in 1915, a ship called the SS Eastland sat docked in the Chicago River, loading over 2,500 passengers for a company picnic. In the panic that followed Titanic's sinking, new maritime laws demanded far more lifeboats on every vessel. The Eastland's owners complied, bolting heavy lifeboats onto the upper deck. Nobody accounted for what that extra weight would do to a ship that was already known among sailors to be top-heavy. As passengers crowded one side of the deck to wave at the crowd on shore, the Eastland slowly rolled over, while still tied to the dock, in 20 feet of water, close enough that people on the pier could reach out and touch the hull. 844 people drowned, many trapped below deck, within sight of solid ground. A safety law meant to prevent another Titanic directly caused a disaster of its own, because nobody stopped to ask what the fix would break. Rewind further, to 1628, and Sweden's King Gustav II Adolf wanted the most powerful warship in the world. He wanted more cannons than any ship afloat, and he wanted it built fast. The result was the Vasa, a towering, gold-gilded warship stacked with 2 full gun decks, heavier at the top than any hull design of the era could safely support. Shipbuilders reportedly ran a stability test before launch, 30 men running side to side across the deck to check if it would tip. After just 3 runs, they had to stop. The ship was already rocking dangerously. The king was informed. He ordered the launch to proceed anyway. On its maiden voyage, the Vasa sailed less than a mile. A light gust of wind pushed against the sails. The ship tilted, water poured through the open gun ports, and Sweden's flagship, the pride of an empire, sank in full view of a crowd gathered to celebrate it, taking dozens of lives down with it. It never even fired a shot in anger. Ship sinking is one kind of catastrophe, but some of the worst mistakes in history happened on solid ground, in cockpits, in control rooms, and in boardrooms. March 27, 1977. Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. Thick fog rolled across a small regional airport that suddenly had to handle two massive 747s it was never built for, after a bombing diverted air traffic from a nearby island. One of those jets, KLM Flight 4805, sat at the end of a single runway, engines running, its captain, one of the most senior and respected pilots in KLM's history, under pressure to take off before his crew hit mandatory rest hour limits. Through the fog, he believed he'd been cleared for takeoff. His co-pilot wasn't sure and questioned him. The captain overruled him. At the same moment, a Pan Am 747 was still taxiing down that exact runway, hidden in the fog, unable to get off in time. The KLM jet accelerated into the mist and collided with the Pan Am plane at nearly 160 miles per hour. 583 people died in the single deadliest accident in aviation history, not from mechanical failure, not from weather alone, but because one experienced captain trusted his own certainty over his co-pilot's doubt, in a cockpit hierarchy where questioning the captain still felt unthinkable. April 26, 1986. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Soviet Ukraine. Engineers scheduled a safety test. Ironically, a test meant to check whether the reactor could survive a power failure. To run it, they had to disable multiple safety systems, something explicitly warned against in the reactor's own operating manual. The test was delayed for hours, handed off to a night shift crew less experienced with this specific reactor type, and then rushed. As the test proceeded, power output became dangerously unstable. Alarms fired. Operators, trained to distrust false alarms in a plant with a history of them, kept going. Within seconds, an uncontrolled power surge tore through the reactor core. A chemical explosion blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid clean off the building, exposing the burning core directly to the open sky. Soviet officials didn't evacuate the nearby city of Pripyat for 36 hours. They didn't publicly acknowledge the disaster for days, even as radioactive fallout drifted across Europe and was detected by monitoring stations in Sweden, a country the Soviets hadn't even informed. Dozens died in the immediate aftermath. The long-term death toll from radiation exposure is still debated today, with estimates ranging from thousands to tens of thousands. An 18-mile exclusion zone around the plant remains largely uninhabited to this day, nearly 40 years later. And Chernobyl is only the second worst nuclear mistake on this list. We'll get to the first one. January 28, 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger sat on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, carrying 7 astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, set to become the first teacher in space, with school children across America watching live. The night before launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, held an emergency conference call. They warned that unusually cold overnight temperatures, the launch morning was forecast near freezing, could cause the rubber O-ring seals in the booster joints to fail. Those seals had never been tested below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Launch morning temperatures were in the low 30s. NASA management pushed back on the engineers, reportedly telling one Thiokol executive to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. Under pressure, Thiokol reversed its own recommendation and approved the launch. 73 seconds after liftoff, a failed O-ring allowed hot gas to escape and ignite the external fuel tank. The shuttle broke apart in the sky, in front of the astronauts' own families watching from the viewing stands, and in front of millions of school children watching on classroom television sets. All 7 crew members died. The investigation that followed found the flaw wasn't a mystery. It was a known risk that leadership chose to overrule. December 2, 1984. Bhopal, India. A pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide had been cutting costs for years. Safety systems disabled or undermaintained, staff reduced, a critical refrigeration unit meant to keep dangerous chemicals stable shut off to save money. Just after midnight, water entered a tank holding 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, a highly toxic gas. Without the refrigeration system running, a runaway chemical reaction built pressure fast. Safety valves that should have contained it had reportedly been flagged as faulty months earlier and never fixed. The gas vented directly into the night air over a densely populated city, while most residents were asleep. People woke up choking, running through the streets in the dark, unable to see or breathe. Estimates of the immediate death toll range from 3,800 to over 8,000 in the first days alone, with total deaths from long-term exposure estimated at 15,000 to 20,000 over the following years. It remains the worst industrial disaster in human history, and it began with a company deciding that maintenance was an expense it could skip. So far, every mistake on this list involved a machine, a ship, a plane, a reactor, a factory. But some of the worst decisions in history never touched a machine at all. In the late 1950s, a new sedative called thalidomide was marketed across Europe, Australia, and Canada as safe for pregnant women dealing with morning sickness. It had been rushed to market with minimal testing on pregnant animals, let alone pregnant women. Regulators at the time simply didn't require it. By the early 1960s, doctors began noticing a sharp rise in babies born with severely shortened or missing limbs. It took years to connect the pattern to the drug, largely because no one had tested it properly in the first place. An estimated 10,000 to 20,000 babies worldwide were affected before the drug was pulled from shelves. In the United States, one FDA reviewer, Dr. Francis Kelsey, repeatedly refused to approve the drug despite intense pressure from the manufacturer, a decision now credited with sparing the US from the worst of the crisis, and one that led directly to the strict drug testing laws still in place today. Not every catastrophic mistake costs lives. Some just cost empires. In 1962, Decca Records auditioned a young band from Liverpool and past, reportedly telling their manager that guitar groups are on their way out. That band was the Beatles. In 1975, an engineer at Kodak invented the world's first digital camera. Kodak's own executives shelved it, worried it would cannibalize their wildly profitable film business. 30 years later, digital photography did exactly that, and Kodak, once one of the most valuable companies on earth, filed for bankruptcy in 2012. In 2000, the founders of a small DVD buy-mail startup called Netflix flew to Dallas and offered to sell their entire company to Blockbuster for $50 million. Blockbuster's executives reportedly laughed them out of the room. 14 years later, Blockbuster was bankrupt. Netflix is now worth well over $150 billion. 3 different industries. 3 different decades. The exact same mistake, dismissing a warning that the future had already arrived. In 2018 and 2019, 2 brand-new Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, crashed within 5 months of each other, killing 346 people combined. Investigators traced both crashes to the same cause, a piece of automated flight control software called MCAS, designed to push the plane's nose down automatically if a single sensor detected the aircraft was climbing too steeply. That system relied on just one sensor, with no backup cross-check, and pilots weren't fully trained on how it worked or how to override it. Reportedly because Boeing wanted to avoid costly new pilot simulator training that might have made the plane less attractive to airlines. In both crashes, a single faulty sensor triggered MCAS repeatedly, forcing the plane's nose down again and again while confused pilots fought the controls, unable to understand why the aircraft kept overriding them. The entire global 737 MAX fleet was grounded for nearly 2 years while the flaw was fixed, a fix that, investigators later found, could have been implemented from the very beginning. April 20, 2010. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico for BP, investigators later found a pattern of cost-cutting and rushed decisions in the weeks before the disaster. A cheaper, faster cement job used to seal the well, multiple negative pressure tests that showed troubling results but were explained away rather than investigated further, a blowout preventer, the last line of defense against exactly this kind of failure, that hadn't been properly tested in years. That night, methane gas surged up the drill pipe and ignited, killing 11 crew members instantly and setting the rig ablaze. It burned for 36 hours before sinking. The well beneath it kept gushing oil into the Gulf of Mexico for 87 days before it was finally capped, releasing an estimated 4.9 million barrels of oil, the largest marine oil spill in history, devastating wildlife and coastline economies across 4 states. March 11, 2011. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake off the coast of Japan sent a wall of water toward the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The tsunami that struck the plant was roughly 46 feet high. The seawall protecting it was built for waves under 20 feet. Here's the part that makes Fukushima different from a natural disaster. A government-commissioned study years earlier had specifically warned that a tsunami of this exact scale was plausible for that stretch of coastline, based on historical records of a similar tsunami centuries earlier. The plant's operator, TEPCO, reportedly downplayed and delayed acting on those warnings, citing the cost and difficulty of upgrading the seawall and moving backup generators to higher ground. When the tsunami hit, it disabled the plant's backup power systems, the exact systems that were supposed to keep cooling water flowing to the reactors if the main power failed. Without cooling, 3 reactor cores overheated and partially melted down. Hydrogen explosions tore through the reactor buildings, live on camera, broadcast to the entire world. Over 150,000 people were evacuated from the surrounding area, some of them permanently. It became the second disaster in history, after Chernobyl, to be rated a level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the highest severity classification that exists. A warning had been written down, in an official report, years in advance. It named the exact type of wave. It was set aside because acting on it was expensive and inconvenient. That single choice is arguably the most expensive mistake in this entire video, because unlike a boardroom decision or a rush test, it was a warning about nature itself, and nature does not negotiate. Look back across every story in this video, and one pattern repeats without exception. The disaster was never really a surprise. Someone rang a bell, questioned an order, wrote a report, or shelved an invention that could have prevented all of it. The catastrophe wasn't the absence of a warning. It was the presence of one, ignored. If the Fukushima warning report, written years before the disaster and shelved anyway, is the detail that's sticking with you, you're going to want to see our next video, where we break down the cover-ups governments tried to hide from the public for decades. Drop a comment. Which mistake on this list do you think was the most preventable? Subscribe to the Paint It so you don't miss it.